So let's get rocking with the webinar tonight. I'm looking forward to this one. Tonight, we have the privilege of having retired Captain Roy Griffith with us. I've known Roy for many years. He used to patrol my district, and we've got some good history together. Roy has spent 27 years with the department, and prior to that, he spent 7 years with Arcata Police Department as a police officer. Roy's got some super exciting stories of chasing poachers and undercover work, but we're going to save that for a later webinar, maybe, Roy. But Roy, thanks so much for being with us tonight. This topic tonight is a huge hit in my family. My wife is tuning in the next room over. And so, Roy, why don't you get us started and tell us how you got into canning wild game and why you got into it.
Hey, thanks, Eric. And it is an honor to be here with you and Captain Olagi tonight. And just so all you folks out there know, Eric Elliott is the real deal. That you guys are very fortunate to have someone running the Advanced Hunter Ed program like him. He walks the walk and talks the talk and puts his family in the field every year in the backcountry, harvesting incredible wild game. I got into this canning when I was up in Arcata because I was young, didn't have a lot of money as a young peace officer. And when the fish were in, the albacore would come in, and there was always just a plentiful amount of fish and never enough space to freeze them. And certainly can't feed your family 5 albacore in 1 week. But we'd grab up those albacore, and I learned to self-taught how to can albacore. And that's where it started, just canning delicious food from the ocean. And as I got more and more into big game hunting, I was just never enough freezer space and never enough, freezer space, especially when you're venturing out to go hunting and you want to bring your delicious game meat with you to share in the field with other hunters and have very good, healthy food while you're in the camp. Ice and dry ice and everything like that only lasts so long, but a couple jars of your previous year's canned game makes delicious meals for your future hunting camp. So that's kind of it in a nutshell, Eric.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about this picture, this opening slide, Roy.
Well, there's I've got a genetic son and I got a son that hunts, and that's Captain Olagi with me there, who I've spent many wonderful hours in the field. And that buck I had the sheer pleasure of harvesting on Jim and Tina Marie's property, Arrow 5 Ranch up in Xena, right on the Humboldt, Trinity County line. And that hunt I was awarded for my years as being a hunter ed instructor. Just randomly, I drew that, was awarded that hunt, or given the opportunity for that hunt. And then that's my $10,000 dog. My blood tracker sits there in the photo with us. So that's just a very special photo to me. And just a great opportunity, just kind of a shout out if anybody's interested in becoming a hunter ed instructor and giving back. The state is really doing some great things to recognize us and recognize our volunteer time and participate in wonderful hunts like that.
So Roy's a lifelong hunter. You've canned meat for 40 years, so you've got probably more experience doing this than anybody that I know, Roy. So thanks again for doing this with us tonight. And our whole goal is to see what we can do with this. Everybody brings home meat in, a variety of ways and shapes. And we're looking at a quarter deer leg here. So we're looking to figure out what we can do with this. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, that's, we could talk all night just about field processing, but I haven't let a butcher or anybody else touch my delicious harvested wild game in at least 40 years. I like to take great pride in knowing that from the time it hits the ground on the mountain to the time I put it before somebody on the table, it's been treated right, treated with the utmost respect, and treated, with the respect of every animal deserves. And Sean's a witness. I get a lot of grief sometimes in the field of just what I leave behind makes the vultures and the ravens and magpies very angry because I leave nothing. But wherever my critter hits the ground, I break it down immediately. And get it cooled and get it bagged and get it on its way home. So it brings us to the goals of the clinic. We want to teach you the whole process of canning from getting it on the mountainside, getting it home and breaking it down and doing all of this yourself. And then you have great pride and great knowledge of what you're putting into those jars, what you're putting into your freezer, and what you're sharing with your friends. And you're taking meat that would normally only last, a couple of years max, in your freezer, even when you wrap it really good. I'm not a fan of vacuum sealing. I'm a big fan of saran wrap and butcher paper, and I can wrap meat in a way that it's good for, even 4 years, 5 years in the freezer. But that takes up a lot of space, and it's aging every day it's in there. But when you can that meat, you're basically preserving it in the quality of the day you harvested it for 20 years to come on the shelf, in your pantry. So
Right on.
we talked about this already a little bit. Why do we can meat? Well, obviously lack of freezer space or no freezer. Just last week I was up in 100-degree weather in Bullard's Bar, and we really got into the kokanee. And we don't ice doesn't last very long, and especially when it comes to taking care of fish. So why not take those fish right out of the water that are beautiful and in perfect condition and get them canned instead of throwing them into a ice chest and letting them sit there for a couple more days of camping. So freezer space, we said, extending the quality of that delicious meat from something that's going to get destroyed over a few years in your freezer. Or, in this day and age of unknown power, I mean, where I live in El Dorado County, we get our power shut off regularly. I have a generator now, but it's just nice to know you have some quality meat that's shelf stable and doesn't require a freezer to take care of it. It also gives you, a delicious, like I was saying, delicious food that you can take to camp. And I've given this away as gift to dear friends that I know are going to enjoy it. A few years ago, I gave away my berry Christmas, where all of my friends got a jam of my Alala berry jam, a jar of jam, and a jar of bear meat that I had canned. So it's just a great way of making your hunting season last and preserving something you've spent a lot of time and hours acquiring.
Right
Next
on.
slide.
Yeah, just out of curiosity, Roy, on this third point, can you put in like neck meat, like even like the hocks, and just
Yeah,
some really undesirable meat into and pressure cook it and make it good?
Oh, absolutely. Great question, Eric. Yeah, you can take all those cuts that normally would be fit pretty much just for grind, shoulders and neck, and all those little bits just come out like you've
Mm.
pressure cooked it for hours in a pressure cooker, and it just really lends itself so perfectly to that night that you and your spouse gets home from work and you don't feel like cooking. And hey, what are we having tonight? Oh, I'm tired. You're tired. Take out a jar of this delicious meat, warm up some tortillas, and you've got a delicious meal.
Awesome. So tell us about this picture, Roy.
Well, we all heard the story of the three little piggies, right? That's the three little piggies hanging in a locker. And I'm not going to give up the hunter ed instructor who did that to the poor three little piggies, but he's a fellow instructor. And let's just say maybe he's out there in radio land tonight. So I don't want to give him up because he's a man of the cloth and he's a city council member and he's a prior mayor but most importantly, a hunter ed instructor who won this incredible hunt, or the privilege of going on this hunt to harvest a pig. And he wound up with 3 pigs. So
Right on.
that's the 3 little piggies getting chilled and getting ready to be butchered up by us.
Very good. Let's get started.
Well, obviously the most important thing you need is your pressure canner. And folks come by these brand new. You can find them in thrift stores. People inherit them from grandparents or, aunts and uncles and people that don't use them anymore. They're a bit of a relic of the past. Everybody's using pressure cookers now for making meals, and some of those are and can be used for pressure canning, but you really got to know your product and know the when you have. None of them are as efficient as the old school pressure cooker. My pressure cooker holds 14 pint size jars, 14 of these delicious little pint-sized jars in one processing. So, and if you do buy one at a thrift store, you want to give it a really good look once over. There's not very many moving parts. There's really only one moving part, the weight rocker we'll be talking about in a few minutes. The only thing that go bad on them in time, if you're buying a used one, is this seal under the lid, which is critical. But these, I have researched and found these seals for friends and stuff for just about every canner you can use canner you'd find on the market. So got to have the canner.
Awesome.
That's number one.
Yeah, tell me about just ballpark price on something like this if you were to buy it new. Do you have any idea?
I would be just, I'd be scrambling, throwing
Okay,
guesses out there. I've not
no
priced it in
sweat.
so many years, but I really recommend thrift stores. I'm a big, Sean knows what a big repurposer I am. I love taking old stuff and making it work again. And they're out there. I mean, every time a friend of mine or I teach somebody this wants a pressure cooker, I pretty much within a few weeks can find a good one in a thrift store.
Right on.
Here's the second most critical component, and this is where you don't want to scrimp money. You know, get what you pay for. You don't want to buy off-market brands. I'm not making a commercial for Ball or Mason, but you don't want to take this incredible meat that you spent all these years literally on some of these hunts to acquire and hours getting it out of the field and then lose it by buying off-brand jars with inferior lids and rings. So get yourself some good jars. I'm a big advocate again of the pint size wide mouth like shown there, but this kind of gives you the 3D of how big they are. The large mouths are much easier to work with for loading them. And they really, they just break down into a perfect meal size for two people when you're making tacos, burritos, or my favorite, nachos. So it's just a good size. And if you're feeding more than two people, you take out a couple of jars. And again, that scenario I talked about in deer camp, you come in late, you've been hiking the hills all day, you're burned out, just take one of these out of your dry goods and warm up some tortillas and you got an incredible meal. The jar itself and these rings can be used over and over. So these two items, I mean, I've got jars I've probably been putting stuff in for 30 years. If friends are good enough to give them back to me, I lose a lot that way by giving gifts. What you can't and should not reuse in this process are the lids. These lids can be used, if you just want to store rice and beans or, a lot of times we use these to put things in the fridge. But when it comes to the pressure canning, you want to invest your money in new lids all the time. And but the jar and the ring, or you can use them over and over. Next slide. Here's some of the just basics. These are your absolute basics that you should have. In a minute, we're going to talk about sterilizing your lids and rings. Well, it's nice to have this little magnet to get those red hot sterilized lids out of the boiling water. And again, to keep your grummy fingers off of them, to be able to take it with the magnet, put it right on your jar and seal it. So that's a good thing to have. Picture there of the new lids. Always have extra lids on hand, because if you're like me, you're going to be picking up jars in thrift stores, and most of the time they're going to be missing the lid for sure. And I wouldn't use a lid that I bought in a thrift store anyway. And then these guys, the tongs are great for lowering the jars into your water if you've already heated up your water. Here we're looking at the meat. Again, we could talk all night about how to break down hindquarters and which cuts are best for this. But again, garbage in, garbage out. You want to take the time. You don't have to get every little bit of sinew, like if you were stir frying this for a nice stir fry. But for pressure canning, little bits of sinew and gristle just melt away and probably add to the healthiness that of the end product. But still, you don't want to put the same stuff you wouldn't put in your grind. You wouldn't put hair or bloodshot meat that's had a bullet go through it. And obviously, you want to keep, and you can see how pristine and clean I keep my my meat as I get it out of the field. So 1 to 2 inch cubes, roughly. Sometimes when you get to the tail end of something, you're going to wind up with smaller pieces, but that's about what you want to wind up with. Then the sea salt, measuring spoons, skewers. This, I like using a chopstick for getting all the air bubbles out, and we'll show that in a minute here in a slide coming up. But it's really critical that you get all the air and you really pack those jars nice and tight to within, I always describe it as this lowermost ring of the jar, right where the threads start. Basically a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch max below the rim of head space. So that's what you're aiming for. That's where you want to get that pack. And you'd be surprised how much cubed meat you can squeeze into 14 jars. It still amazes me every time of how much meat it takes to fill those jars.
Yeah. Why sea salt, Roy?
We know for sure that it's not iodized. We don't want that iodized flavoring. It's natural, it's healthy.
Mhm.
It hasn't been processed as much as regular salt. And again, it's that quality of your product. I got the best here, using so little of it. And here's where you can get creative. We're talking about just a basic recipe tonight, but I'm also going to give you some tips and some stuff that I've done over the years that just makes for some incredible canned meat. So you can start with just filling that jar with meat and putting that 1/2 teaspoon of sea salt on the top. But then you can just start. This is where you can just get creative. And like I was saying, really make those gifts that are just beautiful gifts to give away. Like here, an example of some really finely chopped onions and finely chopped garlic. I'll put just a little bit of I would say 2 to 3 tablespoons, enough just to cover the bottom of the jar with onions, and then pack it halfway, put another little layer of onions and garlic, and then pack it about 3/4 of the way. Then I'll take one of my San Marzano fire roasted tomatoes and slide that down each side of the jar. And then I'll take a fire roasted homegrown chipotle pepper and slide that down the side of the jar. So you wind up with this jar that I don't know if this will translate, but you can see these beautiful peppers and roasted tomatoes down inside the jar of my antelope meat. When you take that out and chop it up for nachos or something, it adds to it. It's just delicious, and it makes for a beautifully flavored jar of meat. Remember, that meat is not only going to be cooking in there for 90 minutes, it's going to sit for its life until you eat it with all those wonderful flavors in there. So that's kind of the sky's the limit, but again, the whole point of all this is to fill these jars with meat. So don't get too carried away and start canning vegetables, because that's a whole nother clash. The vegetables are just a side product to garnish. Think about it as a garnish, and don't think about you're not canning tomatoes or peppers here. So we talked about packing these jars tight and full. It's really critical that you don't have any air pockets. Too much air in that jar can lead to catastrophic failure and the lids popping off or caving in. You want just that little bit of headspace left. And like we're going to talk about over and over, no liquid. I mean, you put absolutely no liquid, but dry meat. And what you wind up with is delicious broth. I never waste any of that. I either drink it or I put it in the dish that I'm cooking. But you wind up with this, all is just created by those goodies that you put in there. And that's basically, like I was saying, marinating that meat for years to come. And you're seeing me use the chopstick there to poke down in there and get those air pockets. And while I'm poking, I'm pushing with my fingers and so far. Now, after I try to do this all in a steps, I don't do one jar start to finish. It really works well if you do this like an assembly line. Even if I'm just putting that layer of onions, I put a layer of onions in all the jars, 1/2 layer of meat, and do this so you're not missing anything. It's critical that you get this all done right. And for consistency's sake, you want to be able to do this time and time again, and know that when I'm handing this gift to Eric, it's not a mystery jar of meat. I'm pretty much 98% sure what it's going to taste like. I've gotten it pretty much down over the years, but you're going to develop your own little flavors and amounts that you like and don't like. And I, for one, don't like stuff super salty. That's why I use a half a teaspoon of salt here that you're looking at. And I certainly wouldn't go over a full teaspoon, but a lot of people swear by a full teaspoon. So, but again, a minimum half for preservation. Then the next critical part is these rings. You know, it's critical that you have a good seal, a nice tight seal, and you don't want gunk on the rings because that's going to literally bake this ring on, and you don't want that to happen. You want that ring to be able to be removed afterwards to get in there. So clean those rims. I use, you want to use vinegar. I say white vinegar, but you can see here, I didn't have white vinegar for this photo. That's apple cider vinegar. Either one works just fine. White vinegar is just a lot cheaper and works better for the next step of the process we're going to talk about. So again, assembly line process, one jar at a time, slide it over to the side and get ready for your clean, sterilized lids and rings. And this is again where I talked about you got that boiling water. You're not going to reach in there with your hands and try to fish those lids out. Get in there with your magnet, grab one. You have your jar, take your ring, screw it on. We're going to talk about at the end that there's a bazillion and one videos on YouTube and the internet about how to do this. A lot of old timers swear you don't have to sterilize your lids and rings because the process of canning itself sterilizes them. This is the way I was taught. And back to what we talked about early on, I spend too much time harvesting this incredible wild game to want to lose a jar or, you know, have one go south with bacteria growth or something. I've never had that happen in 40 years and I don't plan on doing it now. So I sterilize mine. Not so critical with brand new off the shelf cases, but I don't know where those cases have been and what dust and dirt they've been exposed to as they're bouncing around. So I sterilize my lids and ring. But critical part is you don't want to make the mistake of wrenching these rings down because part of the canning process is pressure has to go out of here so the thing sucks down and seals. So it's a matter of just like you just heard right there, just you're not wrenching it down, you're just tightening it. And you'll see when we get a few more videos that slides here that they're actually stuff's gonna come out of them. You're gonna smell your product cooking as it's cooking, and don't be alarmed. So next slide. This is again back to we're buying that canner at the thrift store or inherited grandma's. You want to make sure you got these racks in there. There should be one in the bottom already. And if you can see this, it's not just flat, it has space. And that space is to keep those jars off the bottom of your canner so that jar isn't exposed directly to a hot burner, that you have this space for the water and steam to take place. And you're getting that. This is one of the common items when I've seen canners in thrift stores or someone grabbed one from grandma's garage, that these might be missing. So you should, if it's a double stack canner like my 24 quart one here, you should be getting two of these, or they look like the grill out of a Weber, but some figuration of a rack. So make sure it has racks and make sure there's one in the bottom when you get started. Next. So here you can see where I've started loading my canner and I put my first layer in. First layer goes in on top of one of these, then another one of these goes down, and then your second layer. And you can also notice that I'm being very careful that the jars aren't touching the side of the pressure canner and they're not touching each other. So that's max pack for mine, 7 in each layer, which kind of, you don't have to go 7 because you get these jars in cases of 12, but again, I'm doing it, I'm going to get the most I can. But the reason you want that little bit of space is just, the whole steaming process, things vibrate. You don't want that jar banging against the side or banging against each other. So we got our canner loaded up. Now we're going to take the next step is we're going to add 3 quarts of water. And again, based on your canner size and based on your canner, you can, all of this is available on the internet when you buy your canner or you inherit your canner. It doesn't come with instructions. You can look it up. And this varies. I've seen anything from 2 to 4 quarts. Mine always been 3 quarts of water. And then that quarter cup of white vinegar. The vinegar keeps that smell down I was just talking about as your cooking process goes, and also keeps your canner clean from the staining of all those greases that are coming out of the jars. It keeps it liquefied in the water rather than sticking to the side of your canner permanently. So what I do is that half a cup of vinegar that I was using to wipe my lids, I just dump that in my canner and get the most bang for the buck when you do it that way. The canner lid goes on, obviously. They vary. You can see here, most of them come marked with the little left, right, which way to go, arrows indicating what's locked. And it should be a very secure feeling. It should be like almost like that feeling when you shut the door of an old Buick or something, that you should feel it. And again, that is critical. Also caution you as you're putting your lid on, give that gasket one last inspection that it hasn't been partially bumped out from storage, and tighten that sucker on there. It should be just, it's not like a screwing, it's just a click, and away you go. Next slide, Eric. Now here's this is the very most critical part of the whole process, is getting your canner up to pressure. This isn't the time to go watch the ball game or go out and check the mail or anything. This is where you really have to sit there and babysit your canner. You're gonna, depending on what type of burner you have, gas. I've used gas and electric over the years. I have found electric much easier in this process than gas, especially if you have any kind of breeze or ambient temperatures going on. Like I was talking about last week up there in the campground, 105 degrees outside and a breeze, using a flame to can, but it's all doable. But you want to turn your burner on medium to high to get it started. And then once we're going to move on here to the next slide and start talking about what happens next. You have that vent on the top of the pressure canner will have something like this. All of them will have a vent and an emergency blowout. If you get one from the turn of the century, turn of the last century, some of the really old timey ones don't have this little safety plug, and do not get those, because if this plugs, that's where you can get literally one of these going through your ceiling in your kitchen. So it should have a nice clean. This is important that you check this before you use it every time. Make sure this little vent is clear. You can put a little toothpick through it or a bobby pin, but that's your air release, and this is your safety plug. And you're going to look for a steady stream of pressure coming out of that.
So go ahead, and audience members, why don't you turn your volume up? The audio on these videos is a little bit low. I'm going to start the video now.
And now we're just waiting for a steady stream out of the release valve on the top of the pressure cooker. Sometimes as they're coming to pressure, you'll see some steam coming out of the seal down here on the gasket. That's normal, as long as it's not a steady flow. That's just the whole thing coming to pressure. You'll see little bits of steam being slowly released from the safety valve. That's to keep from the whole thing exploding if you did have an issue of this being plugged. But that is not a steady steam. We'll check back in a few. And now we're just waiting for a steady stream out of the release valve on the top of the pressure cooker.
All right, let's move on to this slide, Roy.
Yeah, we're looking for, critical part is getting all that basically air. You want to replace the air in your pressure cooker with your pressure canner with steam. And you want to make sure that you have all that air is pushed out and you have that steady stream of steam. That's what we're looking for. So yeah, go ahead. And now you can see a stream of steam coming out, but still not what I would consider a steady stream. See the breaks in it. This is important because this is letting all of the air out of the pressure cooker. And it's only when that steam's a steady stream that we know that air is all gone. Still broken, but close. And again, you can see, when it comes to pressure, you can see bits of steam being released around the gasket. That is, at least with my experience, normal.
Super helpful videos, Roy.
Yeah, say a picture's worth 1,000 words, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's listen to what and see what the steady stream actually looks like.
Okay, this is what I consider a steady stream. It's clean, straight, harder to see because it's not interrupted. And you can hear from the sound that it's not interrupted. And that's what you're looking for, is the steady stream of steam being released without the sputtering and spit. Yeah, I hope that makes sense to everybody, what you're looking for there. And sometimes you can kind of, it's going to be hot, but you can put your hand over it. You can just feel that it's just a constant needle of steam coming out of there. And that's what you're going for. Then comes that one part that you really want to make sure is with grandma's pressure canner, or you have a flower pot and not a pressure cooker. You got to have this little weight. And you can see on the weight from the picture there that it's based on your recipe. Like I use, some of these will have a 12-pound, some are in increments of 5, 10, 15. So I use 15 for my red meat, wild game, and I use 10 pounds for fish. And that's the way I've always done it. And that is just indicated by the number that's above the hole that you can see there in your picture. That is going to sit right down on top. Once we get to steady steam, pick our weight, drop that right on there. That's the weight of the rocker. Okay? Eric put this fun little graphic in here for us on the waiting game. This is the most critical part. Now is where you have to sit there and wait for it to get up to pressure. Up to pressure means that it's hitting 10 pounds. When this starts to rattle, we know we're at the 10 or the 15 pounds or the poundage that we're looking for. And then or only then, once that rattle starts, that's the only time you can start your cook time. But it's not just get it rattling and walk away. We're going to talk now about the critical nature. If we don't want this thing just rattling like a banshee, that's no good because we're going to run out of steam. And we don't want it not rattling at all because then we know we're not at pressure. So again, a critical part of your process is babysitting your pressure canner and getting this rattle just right, which we're going to talk about now. We have some videos here that hopefully demonstrate it. This is a rattle that is too fast. We need to slow this down by reducing our heat. This is going to vary with your stove. See the problem there, everybody? That's just a constant rattle. That rattle's just going constantly, and it most likely will run you out of water in your 90-minute processing time. So we're going to back that down a little bit. So just rattle, rattle, rattle. That shows you have steady pressure. But you're not going too fast. And oftentimes throughout your load, you'll have to adjust it, so it's not a set it and forget it kind of thing. Pretty much now, once you achieve this, babysit it for the next hour and a half. 90 minutes. That's recommended pound. For me, at my elevation, it's 10 pounds. Okay, here's what we're looking for. I mean, I've watched a lot of videos over the years, and the old timer will just say, yeah, get your rattle going and you're good. And then, make sure it's a good rattle, and then not really. So I wanted to try to do our best to demonstrate to you what a proper rattle looks like, to know that you're at poundage, but not overcooking and over steaming your product.
Yeah, and I think that's the beauty of having these recorded. People can rewind and listen to it again, and because that's so helpful instead of just, hey, listen for the right rattle.
Sometimes later in the process, as you've lost a lot of steam, and you can see, don't be alarmed, you're going to lose some steam and some liquid coming out around your gasket, and that's just all part of the process of the gasket and lid setting, everything. So you're losing some water. That's why, again, I put 3 quarts in there, and when I'm done and I'm dumping out my cleaning my canner, I probably have about a quart left, or a quart and a half. So it's gone somewhere, and that's why you want to make sure you have enough in there. And for all the reasons we described about proper rattle and so forth, you can see why this process could really be impacted by ambient temperatures and breezes in your kitchen or air conditioners running. So the most less impacted environment you can do this in, the better. It's a challenge to do it outside, but it's plenty doable. A lot of people don't want the smells in your house. You can do it in the garage on a burner, but it's really not that bad. I mean, I've smelled worse. And the vinegar does help that process. I don't want to scare anybody with the smell, but I don't want you to be alarmed by a smell of cooking products, because you're going to have seepage out of the jars as they come to pressure. When we inspect these jars after they come out of the pressure canner, you want to make sure they're sealed. And that's the most critical part. And that's usually done the next day, because once your cooking time is done, you do not want to just take that weight off and open up your pressure canner, because you've got jars in there, several hundred degrees, and you expose them to the ambient temperature of your kitchen, you're going to have glass cracking and lids failing. So, I usually just set this aside and check them the next day. It's usually something I do late in the afternoon or evening while I'm listening to the radio or watching TV, and just let it sit on there overnight and deal with it the next morning. And that's kind of the excitement of when you open up your pressure canner. And I've not had a jar fail in many years, but it does happen. I helped a friend out with this a few years ago, and he bought some of those off the market jars, and we had all kinds of domed lids and but that's again why you want to go with quality. So just leave it closed up and check it the next morning, and you're looking, this is not a good lid. You don't want to hear that, that sound should happen. When you press on it, it should already have happened. You don't want to find this little guy still up. You don't want to hear that sound. It should be flat as a pancake and tight and clean. A lot of people take their rings off and reuse them and put them on their shelf. With just this lid is sucked on here so tight, you need a little wooden spatula or something. Is how I like to pry mine off so you don't break the rims. But I leave the rings on. There's no really benefit unless you really need a rim, but they sell replacement rings as well. So next slide. We just talked about that, proper seal. So there's the fun part. Once they're cooled and cleaned, again, they're going to be greasy and oily. You get them in some nice warm soapy water till, about here, and just clean them all up. And then, label them. You want a good label so you know what you have in there. I try to always date them, because you want to rotate your stock. You don't want to eat all your new stuff. I just rotate, here's a jar of 2021. That's a vintage year, tomato antelope PGO. That stands for pepper, garlic, and onion. So I just, abbreviation so you know what it means. But that's some of my Wyoming antelope from 2021. Here's the pig from just this year, and I call this one taco chipotle, because when those meat was all cubed up and all in my big pan, I put a bunch of taco seasoning in there and mix all those cubes around with that taco seasoning, then pack the jar. And then in these, I just probably doesn't translate well the video, but slid down the side right here is a fire roasted, smoked, homegrown chipotle pepper cut in half on each side. And there's little chunks of garlic floating around there, you can see. So that's the fun. And then we added this just to show you we're not just, wild game. I bet a lot of us out there and also like to fish. And I've really gotten into the kokanee fishing the last couple of years. I just gone crazy about kokanee because I can't get drawn for anything big game anymore. I think the state's rigged it so I don't get any tags. So I have to fill my freezer with something. And man, we have some wonderful kokanee fish in the state of California. So Same thing, again, back to my roots. Look at that beautiful jar of canned salmon, just again, you see where I've got my chopstick as a tool of many tools. I use that as my measuring device to cut those chunks of kokanee, skin and all, right in there. And what a delicious treat. Here's my smoked kokanee. Look how beautiful that is. Smoked slow. And then now just a little tip when you're canning smoked fish, don't smoke it all the way. Don't smoke it shelf stable or backpack stable. Smoke it just halfway, like shown in the picture here for flavor. So it's still a little moist and raw in the middle, because again, that kokanee is going in that jar with no liquid, and all that delicious oil, all that delicious, wonderful liquid off of that fish is now preserving that kokanee forever. Just a really healthy meal. So sky's the limit here, folks. I mean, you can do anything, just not red meat, wild game, fish, wonderful vegetables out of your garden. It's just a wonderful technique. So the sky's the limit. I would recommend for everybody to start out with the basic recipe, just the meat and the sea salt, and then start to be creative a little bit, and add those other ingredients. And if you're gonna pre-season your meat, season it all in a big, that roasting pan like you saw I have, mix it around all really good, get the seasoning equally dispersed, and then start packing your jars. Seems to come out way better than trying to add that seasoning on top, because it's not going to be dispersed through the product as evenly as if you mix it up first.
So there was a couple good questions that came in on the chat. And the first one is, can you can last year's game or fish if you have not had a chance to eat it after it's been in the freezer?
Excellent question. Absolutely. That's a really good question. A lot of folks do this, and kind of what we were talking about earlier about cycling out your meat. So even, you can you can can backstrap if you want to. But yes, this is commonly done. It's very common that you come home from your hunt and you're burned out, you just don't have time. Get those big roasts into the freezer. I do this all the time. And then come next season, now you want to go through and purge last year's red meat and replace it with fresh, and then go ahead and can all that stuff. Then you're again taking that meat that would be in your freezer and getting freezer burn in another year and turning into shelf stable product good for 20 years.
Yeah.
Fish, same. I'd be careful about how long the fish was in my freezer, but I have very commonly done fish that I had to freeze to get it home, salmon and what have you, and albacore. Does albacore come off the boats frozen off? And so, yes, great question.
And then another question came in about, they want to hear more about canning in the field. What's the advantage to canning in the field, and why? When would you do it, and why?
Great question. Just like we talked about refrigeration, heat is your enemy. I've been on hunts many times where, somebody was fortunate enough to get their game early on, and you're kind of waiting around the camp for other people to harvest their meat. And meanwhile, your stuff is sitting in a ice chest and with a limited space. This might be a situation where I would take my prime cuts, like my back straps and sirloins and New Yorks, and get those all wrapped up and keep those, but then take that shoulder meat, neck meat, all that other stuff that's isn't as that I would can anyway when I got home. And if I was stuck in camp, I'd start canning. Like I sent Eric a picture last week to Texas game warden skills, and I sent him a picture of a pressure canner in our campground up at Bullard's Bar, because I was going to stay another day. It was 105 degrees and I was out of ice. So I wasn't going to chance losing those beautiful kokanee. I just canned them all up. We canned a couple limits of kokanee. And just like the red meat, you would be surprised how many kokanee you can get into 14 jars. It's
Yeah.
it's
So tell
amazing.
me
So
about the
great
canning
question.
kokanee,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
kokanee and smaller fish. What happens to the bones?
Yeah, great question. I'm sure we've all had canned salmon as kids, that they just disappear. They become just a nutritious part of that canned fish that especially with the smaller salmon. I'm like, oh, when I used to shad, loved shad fishing, but they are just a
Mhm.
bony bag of bones. But take a bony shad and fill up jars, put a couple tablespoons of mustard in there, and can the shad, and you have a sandwich spread that is to die for,
Mm.
uh, and no bones. So yeah, the
Yeah.
bones just melt away and become a nutritious part of your end product.
How about canning a ground meat?
I've heard of it done. I've never done it myself, but absolutely, it works. Again, you're just packing that jar full. I've seen it, and it kind of cooks down a little bit. A dear friend of mine who taught me half of what I know about kokanee fishing, he smokes them and then he breaks off all that bits of kokanee, flaky kokanee meat, and just packs the jar full of pure meat, no bones, because they just, when you can it just falls right off the bone. I mean, when you smoke it, partially smoke it, it just wants to fall off the bones already anyway. So kind of same principle, rather than filling that jar like, but I just like the look of this that whole whole kokanee just stacked in that jar. But he winds up with what is like the equivalent of ground fish, crumbled fish, packing this jar. So by all means, it would work. If you had a bunch of grind and you were going into next season and you wanted to preserve that grind, by all means, you could pack those jars tight and preserve it that way as well.
Awesome. I've got another question here. 3 quarts of water. Does that mean you're stacking the cans underwater?
No, if you can imagine, on my canner here, 3 quarts of water only gets the canner to about here.
Okay.
You are we are we don't want to confuse pressure canning with a hot bath. Like when you make jam and you immerse those jars in a boiling, that's a hot bath. This meat is actually being preserved by steam, which is hotter than boiling water. They're being preserved by steam and pressure. So those 3 quarts of water is in no way, even just think about it. The second level in that canner isn't even touching the water. It's just all the steaming process, only the lower jars, and they both come out equally the same. But you're not immersing them. You're just making sure you have enough water to make steam and pressure. It's all about the steam and the pressure, and has nothing to do with a boiling of the jars. Good
Love it.
question. I'm glad we clarified that.
Yeah. How about Sean and Greg? Are there any questions that I'm missing?
Yeah, there's a couple more still there that kind of probably apt to answer the adjusting for altitude. And then how tightly does the fish need to be packed? Because it seems like there's some space in there. And is the canner made of steel or aluminum? Does it matter?
The most that I've always seen, we'll just back those in reverse order. That mostly I've only seen aluminum. Some of the really, really old ones are steel, but I think that steel doesn't seal as tightly because it's not as heat friendly. So most of the ones I've ever seen are aluminum. There is some more space with the fish, so if someone's got a really good eye, you do the best you can, but I'm not going to destroy this beautiful fish by smashing it in there, but I do the best I can to fill all the voids. But you're absolutely right. Whoever asked that question's got a good eye. You're not filling that jar as tight with the fish. And altitude, that I refer to like your pressure canner. You really don't have to worry about that until you get up in the ballpark of like 5,000 and 6,000 feet. I live at 1,800 feet, and I just go with the basic cook time. But because what we're talking about is pressure and not heat. So that's like boiling time. You extend boiling time when you're making spaghetti or pasta for higher elevations, but we're talking X number of pounds of pressure. And it might take that canner longer to get at that pressure at a higher altitude, but 10 pounds is 10 pounds. And the time, we're only starting that time, or 15 pounds, depending on what kind of meat we're doing, when this baby starts rattling. So that's a good question.
Outstanding. So this is my question, Roy. What's the most unusual game meat or fish that you've ever canned?
Glad you didn't ask me what I've ever eaten, because y'all know I'm kind of weird on that front. I've eaten about everything. I
Yeah.
would say the most fun I've ever had, and Sean can attest to this, was my berry Christmas. You know, I canned that. People, you know, I grew up as a young warden with, you know, bear meat is unedible. You know, it's horrible, and you know, take the rug and the hide and leave the rest. And it all comes down to how you take care of it. And that canned bear was so absolutely delicious because I just treated that critter like all my other critters. Daryl and I broke it down right in the field, you know, and you know the story on that. I never was a bear hunter, but they were trying to take it away from us. And I want to be able to walk up to a microphone when I'm testifying and saying that bear meat is delicious when you treat it right. And it is. It was phenomenal. And I had the joy of giving dear friends a berry Christmas. It was a jar of bear meat and a jar of jam. So I think that was
Love it.
probably one of the most unique things.
Yeah.
And you know, other than some of these crazy creations I've come up with, like my Chipotle antelope and stuff, it's a lot of fun. You know,
Yeah.
I was saying the sky's the limit on just creativity of what you want to pack in those jars with your wonderful wild game meat that you've harvested.
Yeah. We got cut off on the last slide, but Roy agreed that to include his email address. So I'll include that to everybody that registered. I'll send Roy's probably want to punch me out right now. But yeah, I'll include his email address. If you've got questions and that we have not addressed, shoot him an email. But Roy, I just want to thank you so much, man. I thank you so much for you've dedicated your whole life to serving and helping others. And I honestly think that I've got the best job going in the state. And in a
Hmm.
lot of ways, I owe that to you. This whole hunter education program would not be the same without what you did. So all of us owe you a huge debt of gratitude. And I just want to say thank you so much, man.
Thanks, Eric. I really appreciate it. And I'm proud to be part of the family.